Around 1900 BC, the Melchizedeks made a bold decision. One of them would appear physically on earth to reignite the fading light of spiritual truth. That being was Machiventa Melchizedek, remembered in ancient tradition as a mysterious priest king of Salem. This message was revolutionary for its time. The entrance in the kingdom of God came not through sacrifice or ritual, but through simple faith. In this segment, we explore how his teachings shaped the spiritual foundations that will later prepare the world for the life and mission of Jesus of Nazareth. So, Derek, tell us of what happened afterwards once they decided and Machiventa came down here.
Yeah. So, as you said, I think we stopped at about 3000 BC. They were getting worried. There's a few problems, right? As we talked about, the light of truth was fizzling out. They knew that Michael's bestowal was coming. They didn't know exactly when, but they knew that they had to do something to prepare for it, right? They needed to set up some sort of foundation that he could build on. And 3, they still had to contend with Caligastia and all of his crew running around trying to mess things up, because they were still all here.
Yeah, and the whole point is to create chaos. That's their intention, right?
Yeah, and you can see, especially with the example of Adam and Eve, he was pretty wily and cunning and was willing to try and mess things up any possible way that he could.
Yeah.
So, as you said, they're sitting there waiting. They're not exactly sure when Jesus is going to come, but they know he is, and they chose to do the best thing that they could under the circumstances, which was to have one of them volunteer to physically incarnate and do what's called an emergency bestowal. And it's called an emergency because it's not part of the usual plan.
Yeah, it's not the sequence of evolution usually.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the parameters of this kind of bestowal are really, really limited, right? So basically what he was here to do was to reignite that light of truth and to try and build some sort of foundation for when Jesus came. That's all he was here to do.
Kind of sets things straight because, and this is, I like how you summed this up in last episode, where once Adam and Eve died, there wasn't any, administrative people, beings that would kind of point us in or give us a compass. It was a long period of time where we had to have contend with what we knew before. So what happens, in all that period, that you lose sight or the focus on what it is. So you have to kind of correct everything because, I imagine, and there's a movie, I don't know if it was, I don't know, I want to get your opinion. I don't know if you remember Noah or like the old biblical stories. If you see the movies, a lot of the tribes and a lot of how the time is depicted is very violent and very savage. It's a human sacrifices and human, But anyways,
that's a really good point that you made that we're going to actually be talking about.
yeah. Well, it's interesting, kind of put the context, because we kind of talk about the Bible and we see Abraham and Melchizedek, at the same point as Jesus. No, this is already the Roman administration, so they're pretty civil in, what can be said about the ancient world. But back in that day, it was very, very savagery. A lot of savagery.
It was, and that's part of the reason that he came, was things were degenerating, right?
Exactly. So please continue.
So basically he incarnated. The actual date is 1973 years before Jesus was born.
Okay.
Is the date that they give us. And he wasn't born as a baby or anything like that, just came as a person. And there's no glorious flashes of light or anything like that. He just appeared and walked into a guy's tent and said, "Hi, I'm Melchizedek, the priest of the Most Highs."
Okay.
And the guy's sitting there going, "Really?
All right." Okay.
Tell me more. You want to stay for dinner?
Yeah, that would be interesting conversation.
Right? Yeah. So he basically incarnates in the area of, well, we all know he was called the Sage of Salem.
Mm-hmm.
And he basically set up camp in Salem, which is now Jerusalem, right?
Okay.
And he, yeah, so he wasn't like a superhuman sort of person like that. He didn't need, there was no tree of life. It
Yeah,
had
he was
been
a
burnt.
more of a regular Joe, right?
He was just given a body, and he was only there for a short period. He only stayed for 90 years, actually. He was there for
Yeah,
90
the
years, which is,
regular
yeah,
standards.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, but he appeared as like an adult, and he left as an adult and stuff like that. So he just appeared. But this is
Okay.
why the biblical record of him is remembers him as having had no mother or father.
Okay.
That's actually how they describe him, as
Okay.
having had no mother or father. And
Okay.
I think it's pretty extraordinary that they even remember that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Which is
yeah,
so
but
clear who he
that's why.
is. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. There's a lot of confusion about who he actually was and everything, and a lot of the records of Melchizedek and who he was were, uh, well, that's another story, but they were basically destroyed at a certain point, or manipulated to tell a different story
Okay.
to elevate Abraham
Okay.
as the father of monotheism and Judaism. But
Okay.
that's like a story we probably won't be able to get into right now.
All right.
But again, first and foremost, he wasn't here to upstep civilization. He wasn't here to, biologically uplift the planet or anything like that. He was here to reignite the light
Mm-hmm.
of truth and prepare the way for Jesus. And that's
Okay.
that's that's all he was here for, and that's all he did. But he did it
Okay.
really well, uh,
Okay.
because, as we know, um, well, it's attributed to Abraham, but Abraham is the father of all of the Abrahamic religions, the monotheistic
Yeah.
religions, right?
Yeah.
It's actually
Exactly.
Melchizedek who did all of that.
Eh, Yeah. Exactly. He's
My,
and we're gonna see in a minute, but he's the one. I
yeah,
mean, he was one of our students, so that's where it all came from, right?
that's right. Yeah. So he sets up in Salem, Jerusalem,
Mm-hmm.
and he starts teaching. And
Okay.
within a few years, he's starting to attract a lot of followers and students. And he set up a school, and he
Okay.
started training missionaries.
Okay.
And he he really didn't have to teach them a lot. It was very, very basic what he was teaching them. And what he taught them was, like, they kind of had a bit of a creed.
Yeah.
And the creed was, I believe in El Elyon, the Most High God, the only universal Father and Creator of all things. That's
Mm-hmm.
the first thing. Second thing, I accept the Melchizedek covenant with the Most Highs, which bestows the favor of God on my faith, not on sacrifices and burnt offerings. And we'll be talking about that more in a little
Yeah.
bit.
Yeah. That's it. That's important.
And third one is, I promise to obey the 7 commandments. He had 7 commandments instead of 10.
Okay.
Moses built on those. Excuse me. Um, so yeah, seven commandments for Melchizedek, and Moses built on that tradition and
Okay.
gave 10. And that was it. That's all he taught. So
Okay.
again, it's just, we're building a foundation here, right?
This is
Um,
important because I think, and we're going to go dive into it. It's important this is where the covenant with of God and Abraham comes from, right?
yes, yes,
So this is important to know where all
yeah.
this comes from. Yeah.
And this teaching is the source of all of the similarities we find in the world religions. This golden rule,
Mm.
underlying golden rule sort of mentality, that finds its origin in Melchizedek and his teaching.
Okay,
The
that's
from
interesting.
It's called the Salem schools or the Salem missionaries, and
Okay.
over this 90-year period, he's teaching all of these people, and he's sending them out.
So yeah, you're
And
seeding and you're different ways throughout all these, I mean,
right,
generations, because in 90 years, you would probably have like 3 generations at least there,
yeah,
3 or 4
yeah,
generations going out,
yeah.
you know?
And it's largely through the work of these missionaries in this school that he set up that this foundation was able to survive down through 2000-ish years until Jesus was born
Okay.
and came and
Okay.
took up that. So this is kind of what his plan was. Okay, so his vision for Abraham, right? Abraham's
And
comes
yeah,
comes into this. So
yeah, this is important that you make the tie and tell us who Abraham is and why
yeah,
he's
so
such the favorite teacher's favorite pet, let's say.
kind of right, but
Yeah.
he was actually chosen while his father was chosen. They were watching his bloodline before Machiventa incarnated because
Okay.
they could see that within a generation or two, someone with Abraham's qualities was going to be born.
Okay.
And so when Melchizedek incarnated, he got Abraham's father, I can't remember his name, but he got the whole family to come over. He invited them to come over. Instead, they went up and they stayed in Haran for a long time. And Melchizedek's like, well, come on. And so he extends an invitation for them to come down. And he basically knew Abraham was going to be born, and he was kind of targeting him
Yeah, this is interesting
because
of what you're
yeah,
saying and what we were talking about, the foresight and that ability to
the
see,
foresight again, the
Yeah.
foresight. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. So, it was he could see Abraham's potential, but it took a long time for Abraham to really come around and give up all of his own personal ambitions.
and that's part of the biblical story of what Abraham already had and
Yeah.
what he had to give up. So that's really part of
Yeah.
the foundational stories about who
Yeah.
we have to become and
Yeah.
transition to get close to God. So it's also a
That's
very important archetype in who we want to become, right?
yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. So it actually took to the point where it took Melchizedek sitting Abraham down and offering him this covenant to
Hmm.
have Abraham finally give up all of his ambitions. He wanted to be a king. He wanted to set himself
Yeah.
up as kind of a king, right? And he like had this huge army and leaders, and he was going to set up this city, and he totally was able to do it. He was really well respected and a great leader. It took he had to give up a lot
Yeah.
for to do what he totally believed in what Melchizedek was teaching him. It just took him a lot to give up all of his
Yeah,
earthly ambitions, right?
and this is interesting because you might please reflect on this, and if whom is watching is how many times, I mean, you're presented and with a lot of the bountiful, but then you have an anchor, and that's why I think what's the word, that when you do without your material possessions, when you don't have that dependency and when you're free of them, then you were able to pursue these higher
Yeah,
objectives or ideals. So it's important to not to anchor yourself
yeah,
on the material objects, or not even objects, situations. I
yep,
know that many times you have to have that job because it's going to pay for your living, but you don't know that once you go beyond that, you might be
yeah,
able to get something even better. That's going to be you're going to be in a much better situation. But it's that fear that you're anchored, that you
yep,
have to let go. So just wanted to get
yeah.
that disclaimer in. But
That's
please
that's
continue.
really important.
Yeah.
And it was actually the covenant, as I said, that turned Abraham around, right? It's Melchizedek saying, you give up these ambitions of yours, and your descendants will number greater than the stars.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is
right?
important. And the covenant is important because this is something very special for us because of our
Yeah,
condition, right? So please
right.
let us know.
And so in his saying that, he's sort of telling Abraham kind of what his overarching plan for Abraham's descendants was going to be, right? So they actually had a plan for Abraham's descendants, and that was they were going to become a race of spiritual teachers to serve the whole planet.
Okay.
They were going to take Melchizedek's teachings, and then when Jesus came along, it was going to be upstepped. That was part of the foundation, this race of spiritual people and teachers, and they were going to be consecrated, and they were going to be sent out by Jesus as and they were going to be these guides and teachers for the whole planet, which is like just something to imagine. That would have been pretty amazing, right?
Which
And that
to an
was part of this
extent did
foundation,
happen.
sort
It
of,
did
kinda.
happen, but not,
Yeah,
yeah, but
but
not in the way or
things
the
happened.
intention they planned. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Which is going to be interesting. That's going to be next. But I mean, before we get to the
Yeah,
next one, just
yeah.
tell us a little bit more about
So
Abraham
so
and
that's
Melchizedek.
that's what Abraham's descendants were chosen for. They were
Okay.
supposed to become these spiritual teachers and guides for the planet,
Okay.
right? Who
Yeah.
Jesus was supposed to concentrate and send out and further train and all that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
So now we get to this covenant, right? And so Machiventa sits down and says, your descendants, if you give all this up, your descendants will number, more than the stars and all that kind of stuff. But the most important thing was representatively, he as representing divinity and Abraham as representing humanity. He made a covenant with our whole planet. Divinity made a covenant with our whole planet that said God agrees to do everything. All we need to do is believe his promises and follow the teachings of those sons that he sends. And that
This is
is
very
not
interesting.
something that on normal worlds, a lot more is required, because
Yeah.
we know we on those other worlds, you have the planetary prince, you have all of the teachings, you have all of the
There's
knowledge
a
of the
structure.
cosmos and the
Yeah.
cosmology. You understand what you're supposed to be doing spiritually. There's a choice that needs to be made, things like this, right? All of
Yeah.
that kind of stuff is known on the planet. We have no idea what we're supposed to be doing here. And
Yeah.
so it's a special Urantian covenant, a covenant with the people of this planet that all we have to do is believe. That's the only
Okay.
thing we have to do.
This is very
And that's
important.
super important.
Yeah.
And that is why, in my mind, that is the most important thing to take out of the whole Melchizedek story.
Yeah, which is,
Yeah,
I think this is another podcast to go into all the details of what he did, but
kind of right. Yeah. So
yeah,
so that for them back then, 2,000 years before Jesus, was, and you touched on this, because civilization has really degenerated, right? They're like
yeah,
really violent and they're killing people, and
yeah,
their religious practices revolved around currying the favor of God through deeds and sacrifice, blood
yeah,
sacrifice. And he's sitting there and he's saying, no, you don't need to do any of that stuff. You need to believe what God's messengers are telling you.
yeah,
That's all you got to do.
yeah. Very
You
simple.
just you got to believe. That's
Yeah,
all. And that is something that even now, so many people on our planet have so much trouble accepting that that's all you have to do. You just have to have this total belief.
and that's, I think, the particular thing that we have here, that we have to believe without seeing, and the greatest thing about the faith that we have here. But once you understand it, once you know that becomes, I'd like to say a habit, but once you have that certainty even if it's something really crazy, but that if your intention, and that's very important, if your intention is in the right place and you want good for you and the rest of who's around you, most likely things are going to be falling, and not in the way that you're expecting it, but in a very much better and wiser way. I've come to understand and have that experience.
Yeah. I think maybe a lot of people have trouble with it because it just feels too easy. It's
Yeah.
like, what do you mean? That's all I got to do? But you know how hard it is to really believe?
And especially at
Uh,
the backdrop that we have today with all the situation, all this material world and the
Yeah,
secular situation. I mean, I see a lot of people being lost in unreason because, I
yeah,
mean, since there's not a straight, a totem pole
yeah.
that you can align to. There's nothing, and
That's
people
right.
just
We're in a special situation where, as compared with the inhabited planets who have those physical manifestations of the divine government standing there that you can see, we are required to believe without seeing,
yeah,
without
yeah,
having that proof.
yeah,
And that's probably what's so difficult about it, even though it sounds so easy,
yeah, yeah.
you know? Yeah.
Yeah, but it's always
So,
very important to have that spiritual receptivity. But
yeah.
yeah, please continue.
So that's the most important parts of what Melchizedek did here, and that's what, as we said, convinced Abraham to drop everything, and he basically took up control, not control, but he became the administrator of the Salem schools of the Salem
Yeah.
city. It was an actual city. There's at they say that there was, like, they had a tithing system so that they could support all of the missionaries and stuff.
Okay.
Um, they had up to 100,000 people in that
Really?
city paying tithes. So that's not even counting all the people who weren't. There was apparently 100,000 people at the height of this when Melchizedek and Abraham were still both there. That's a lot of people.
It's interesting how this is, how the story of Abraham is where we kick off basically the story of modern. I don't want to say modern, but what we know about Judaism
Recorded.
and
Yeah,
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 recorded. Not just this creation myth, but now we have something that is really happening with the people, with, like you're saying, a community, with the descendants, as it was pointed out. So it's really interesting, all this and how, our history, once you look at it in a global way, in a more round way, not just with what we have with the information, when you bring in, it's like, those, those movies or those books where you start getting little bits and pieces, but once you start getting the full picture, you understand everything that's happening
yeah,
around. So I really
yeah,
like these podcasts that we're doing. And this is just the segue into what the fourth revelation is going to be, which is Jesus,
yeah,
and we're going
yeah.
to go dive into that. So before we leave, anything else that we want to stress about Melchizedek?
Well, there's a few things, I guess, that we can
Okay.
use to sort of land on, but I guess one of the questions is, did it work?
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think when you look at it, I mean, we do have what are called the Abrahamic religions, right? We have
Yeah.
that foundational monotheism
Mm-hmm.
across a lot of the world religions that are wrongly attributed, well, sort of wrongly attributed to Abraham, but that it comes from Melchizedek.
Yeah.
So in that regard, totally worked.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely.
Um, it kind of, this vision that he had of Abraham's descendants becoming this race of spiritual people that would go around the world and uplift everybody. I don't know how much that really worked. And you have to ask, well, what happened?
Yeah.
And for the most part, I'm going to say Caligastia happened. He messed it up.
Yeah.
He had 2,000 years to manipulate and distort this.
Which is what always happens. He is always
It's what
his hands.
happens. Yeah.
Yeah. Got his hands in
And so
everything.
by time Jesus comes, basically the Salem teachings are all twisted and distorted into this nationalistic, institutionalized, frozen and unwielding religion
Yeah.
that ended up rejecting Jesus. We're totally
Exactly. Rejecting
jumping
and
ahead now. So
and crucifying him in the end.
yeah.
Yeah.
I still kind of feel like you can't say that it was a failure though.
No, no, no,
And I
no,
think
because the bases were there. Yeah.
yeah, and I think in terms of final thoughts, Melchizedek's mission and his bestowal really it 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 sits there as a turning point for us. Up until Melchizedek, everything was just a total disaster. The planetary prince, he betrayed the planet and went into rebellion. Adam and Eve, they failed, they defaulted. Melchizedek came along and it stuck. Not
Okay.
totally completely the way he was hoping, but it stuck
But
enough that when
sufficiently
Jesus
enough.
came along,
Yeah.
yes. And we've still got the traditions from that still. So that's kind of rock bottom, right?
Yeah.
3000 BC is kind of rock bottom, and then when he comes along, it starts building again. And
Yeah.
we'll see how it builds in the next few podcasts and stuff. So, yeah,
Awesome. Awesome. So
it's not a V though.
no,
We're
no,
not
no,
we're
no,
not
it's
looking at a
never.
V because
No, and as
yeah,
long as there's a human factor, I don't think we can ever call it a V. I
yeah.
mean, it's a progress in the timeline. So, I mean, this is
Well,
great.
we have to remember that for the past 200,000 years, except well until Melchizedek, right? So 200,000-ish years. Caligastia has been pretty much free here to do
Yeah.
whatever he wants, to mold civilization in the way that he wants. And I feel like a lot of our civilization, the virtues that we celebrate, the things that really we put on a pedestal are backwards
Okay.
because we celebrate our CEOs and all of this kind of stuff, right? This business mentality and the people who are rising to the top in our society right now, the cream, they're psychopathic, you know.
Yeah, their
A
motives
lot of them like
are not
to
aligned.
to become a politician. I know we're getting a little freaky here, but to become a politician, to become a CEO, in society today, you got to have you got to have a little bit of narcissism, psychopathy, probably a little sociopathy. Those are the things that are put on a pedestal, these virtues, and everybody looks at them. Oh my God, these people are great. Um, I think it's all backwards.
Definitely,
And
definitely.
I think that's why I said it's not a V. I mean, we got a crash all the way down to Melchizedek, and now it's more of a badly shaped L.
No, definitely.
So,
So
yeah,
So yeah, and I think
so
this is good to later talk about the
yeah,
situation, and what you just mentioned on the situation, the virtues that we or the what we give virtue to. I mean, it's important so that we can
yeah.
realign. Uh,
It's a time of realignment right now, which
yeah,
we'll talk
yeah,
about in another podcast as well, I'm sure. But
definitely,
um,
definitely, a lot to
yeah,
talk about.
yeah.
But well,
So
it was a pleasure, Derek. Up to this point, that we got to basically the beginning of the Abrahamic traditions, and what we're going to be seeing in the next podcast, which is going to be the life and teachings of Jesus. So, thank you for being here. It's always been a pleasure.
me too. I can't wait until the next one. Thanks so much for having
Awesome.
me. Yeah,
Awesome. And to all our subscribers, just remember that we're here every week, so you don't even have to put the remind me every day. You're going to have a new video, basically. And if you liked what we said, be sure to share it with other people that might find something interesting in what we said. So till next time, I'm Santiago Nilan. This is The Divine Within, the invisible connection with God. Take care and carpe diem. On the Divine Within podcast, we'll share real conversations to help you find a personal connection with God. My goal is to support your faith, growth, and journey toward discovering the divine within yourself. Join us to deepen your faith and spiritual journey.